The Cincinnati Bengals must pay Ja'Marr Chase to avoid disaster this season. That and more on today's edition of Locked On NFL.
The new Locked On NFL. The madman Tyler Rowland is your double shot of NFL espresso with the Locked On local experts on every major story. Get ready. Rowland is revving up. The new Locked On NFL starts now. Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Football fans, welcome in to the new Locked On NFL, bringing you a double dose of the NFL's biggest stories with the help of our local experts that know your favorite team like no one else. I am your host, the madman, Tyler Rowland, joined today by Locked On NFL expert Lauren Cox. In today's show, I'm going to tell you why the Bengals must pay Ja'Marr Chase to avoid disaster this season. Also, I'll tell you why Dak Prescott has become underrated even by his own team. And we'll talk about who has the best roster in the NFL. Before we do, I want to thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen of the day and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On NFL podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure that you tune in later and step into the barbershop with Tony Wiggins as he chops it up on the biggest NFL stories here on Locked On NFL. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. With that being said, though, Lauren, the Ja'Marr Chase situation has reached a tipping point here. He's still not practicing after a weird appearance in practice last week. Week one has arrived, and Cincinnati has a chance to really throw away their hopes and dreams for this season if they don't get him paid. But our guys over at Locked On Bengals, Jake Liscow and James Rapine, talked about this situation recently.
Look, I think Ja'Marr is certainly preparing to play mentally. You have to, right? At the same time, the fact that he skipped practice, it didn't participate in practice. Skipped is the wrong word. Didn't participate in practice after returning last week for a couple of sessions that weren't open to the media. Message sent. It's very clear what he wants, and he's serious about it. I mean, that was a huge thing to do in that situation, and to miss both of those practices, to not be suited up, to not be participating. So, do I think there's a chance that Ja'Marr misses sometime? Yes. Do I think he sits out the entire season? No, zero chance. So it depends on how you want to look at it that way. At the same time, from a deal standpoint, I'm cautiously optimistic that they can get something done.
They better get something done. I mean, to me, Lauren, this entire season has been set up as a last dance for the current version of the Bengals. Hendrickson wants more money. They lost DJ Reader. They had to let go of some pieces on defense because they knew they had to pay T. Higgins. They had to pay Joe Burrow. They have to pay Ja'Marr Chase. Well, they don't want to pay T. Higgins. Okay, makes sense. You don't pay T. Higgins. You franchise tag him because you want to pay, or you franchise tag Higgins because you want to pay Ja'Marr Chase. Well, now they're dragging their feet on paying Ja'Marr Chase, and this is such a critical season. The Bengals had the Super Bowl run, and then they've kind of taken a step back the last few years, finished last in their division last year. Like, they do not have time. They do not have the security as a franchise to sit on their hands with this. So I think the Bengals are just staring disaster in the face right now and ruining their last dance season if they don't get Chase happy and get him his money right now, and he deserves it.
Well, I also feel like the Bengals can sit back on the security of their quarterback and say, well, okay, do we need to pay a bunch of money to a bunch of wide receivers when we have someone like Joe Burrow that maybe can make wide receivers? I mean, do the owners of the Bengals look around and go, well, you know, the Chiefs have a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, and he was just fine when they let Tyreek Hill go elsewhere. We've seen the Baltimore Ravens win that division and make playoff runs without having
Josh Allen
paid wide receivers. Like, maybe they're looking towards the future in the NFL here where it's about quantity of good receivers as opposed to like quality of great receivers. Even like Green Bay with Jordan Love, like they don't have a true number one receiver over there, but they feel really good about how that offense is going to go. Like, I can see them saying, okay, maybe this isn't the position we want to invest big in, and we'd rather spend that salary cap money elsewhere to bolster more of the roster around Joe and keep him safe, because obviously the injury last season was their big flaw more than anything else.
Well, I think you're right about like the money ball aspect of the wide receiver position. It's definitely something. You see the Bills trading Stephon Diggs. It's kind of like they're looking at it like, oh, all these other smart teams are doing this wide receiver by committee thing. Maybe we should. But I personally think with the Bengals, that would be a disastrous approach, because what made the Bengals so special and what, boom, flipped them from one of the worst teams to one of the best teams in the league was that special connection between Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. So I feel like you're right about the money ball wide receiver thing, but the Bengals situation specifically, I think that it would be ill-advised for them to think that they could pull that off. And I think they need to pay Jamar Chase right away. I would expect that he does get paid here before week 1. I just think it would be crazy. But looking at a different wide receiver situation down in Miami on South Beach, the Dolphins got Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle back for practice. And thank the heavens, because Odell Beckham has been a no-show. Kyle Krabs from Locked On Dolphins talked about that.
We're not off to a great start with Odell, right? And I do think Odell, the vision on passing downs to be the third threat, I think he can bring some really good value. But when the name and the household brand expectation is Odell Beckham, it comes with a certain expectation of performance. And I don't think he's going to be that. I don't think he has to be that. But this is somebody that got a significant incentive-laden contract. And I don't know how many of those incentives he's going to hit. I probably am tempering my expectations for the incentive portions of Odell maximizing his production.
Well, I think Kyle has a few things right there. He doesn't have to hit the expectations the public has. The reality is the name value of Odell Beckham is worth a lot more than Odell Beckham, the player, right now. But I got to say this, Lauren, and there's a reason they call me the madman. I am drinking the haterade. I think Odell went to Miami to retire, which is a great city to go retire to, I think. But I just don't think that I think Odell Beckham is more locked into being a superstar as a person than he is to being his best version on the football field right now. Again, I'm drinking haterade. I admit it, but I don't think Odell Beckham went to Miami with any intention of being the best version of himself. I think he went there because it's a great place to live.
It feels to me like the Dolphins thought he would come and be like LeBron James in LA, where it's like, yeah, it's the end of his career and that's a great place for him to do things off the field, but you could still get that superstar level player. Just happens to be in a big city that's a great place to have a good time off the field. But I can't help but feel like if the Dolphins season is hinging on the number 3 receiver, Odell Beckham, who hasn't had 1,000 yards since before coronavirus was a thing, then I think they've got bigger fish to fry there, right? I mean, between Hill and Waddle and, Jonnu Smith at tight end and a pretty stacked backfield, like they should be fine with or without, 500 yards from Odell Beckham. Is that going to be the difference here for Tua? Like, if it is, I think there's something else bigger here. They should be able to get by, even if he is kind of phoning it in and calling it quits here in Miami.
Yeah, give the ball to Braxton Berrios, a guy who actually wants to be there, be on the team. But besides that, obviously, the more important players are Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and they're back at practice. So I agree with you there, although I think Odell is there for the wrong reasons. I think you're right that they don't actually need him at the end of the day. I think Miami will be just fine. I'll tell you somebody who is needed. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, River Craycraft will be coming back off injured reserve, and that receiver core will be just fine.
Yeah, got to get the River Craycraft mentions in here. That was absolutely perfect. With that being said, though, I will say somebody who is needed is Dak Prescott, and I think that his own team is underrating him now. Do want to let you guys know, though, that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. All right, guys, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. It is America's #1 sportsbook, but we got something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. If you're looking to make that $5 bet, Lauren, cover your ears. Tennessee Titans +4.5. Week 1 against the Bears. think that's good value, folks. But with that being said, make sure that you head over to FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Lauren, let's continue today's edition of Locked On NFL. I am your host, the Madman, Tyler Rowland, here with Locked On NFL expert Lauren Cox. We talked about Cincinnati needing to pay Jamar Chase, the wide receiver situation in Miami. Now I want to tell you why Dak Prescott has become underrated by his own team and why the Pittsburgh Steelers are set to make the playoffs. We'll also talk NFL's deepest roster at the end of the show. Before we do, new reminder, this is the new Locked On NFL podcast. Make sure that you get subscribed, stay subscribed, and tune in this afternoon to hear Tony Wiggins in the barbershop chopping up all things NFL. But with that being said, let's talk about this Dallas Cowboys situation because I think Dak Prescott needs his money as well, Lauren. I think the Cowboys are underrating Dak Prescott as a player and thinking that they can just find a better option if they let him move on after the season. And our guys on Locked On Cowboys, Landon McCool and Marcus Mosher, talked about that as well.
To me, it feels like if a deal's not done in week one, Dak just doesn't want to have contract extensions during the season. I kind of feel like if a deal's not done in week one, it's not going to get done during the season. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I kind of got that. I understand where you're getting that impression just based on how the tone of it yesterday was.
But and how it's gone before. Like Dak has just kind of gone this like once we hit week one, we're not talking contract stuff, right? Like
yeah, that's true. That could be something that he's kind of mandated with his agent. So yeah, I mean, look, I think a couple other things that we hadn't mentioned is if you look at the structure of CeeDee Lamb's contract that he just got. Man, it sure looks hollowed out for a big quarterback contract in the upfront part of the years, right? Like it definitely looks to be structured in a way that they expect to be paying a quarterback a bunch of money.
Yeah.
Well, they better. I think that at the end of the day, Jerry Jones is an older man. All right. And at some point, you start to see your mortality. And I think that if the Cowboys are dumb enough to think that they can just replace Dak Prescott in a reasonable amount of time if they let him go after the year. I got to tell you, Lauren, I think this is similar to the Kirk Cousins thing in Minnesota. And I think that it's obviously Dak Prescott is a better player. There isn't the Achilles injury that he's coming off of, and it makes the equation a little bit different. But I think Minnesota thought that they could easily replace Kirk Cousins and still remain competitive. And I don't think that they can. Personally, I don't think Sam Darnold is going to get it done. And I'm not a big believer in J.J. McCarthy either. It's harder. You cover the Chicago Bears, Lauren. It is hard to find a good quarterback. It's not easy. So if the Cowboys are dumb enough to underrate Dak Prescott and not realize that he's a top 10, top 12 quarterback and let him go after this season, teams are like Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins got $180 million coming off an an Achilles tear in his 30s. All right, Dak Prescott is going to get paid by somebody, and I just think Dallas would be just absolutely stupid if they were to not pay Dak Prescott and keep him around. And Jerry Jones, at his age, like, how much longer do you got to try to rebuild from the ground up with a new quarterback? I just think it's insane that they're not paying him.
It seems like they tried to find that like sneaky, can we find our Dak Prescott replacement on the fly with Trey Lance? Like that was his way of saying, maybe we can make this trade, develop this guy, and then when Dak's up, Trey Lance, who have been here a couple seasons, I can fix him. Number 3 overall pick, he could be the guy. And I think we saw pretty clearly this preseason that he's number 3 behind Cooper Rush. Like that's just not the answer for them. So now I think Jerry Jones is back to a corner saying, "Oh crap! Like I don't have a better option for myself right now." And but you keep talking about Dak Prescott as a top 10, top 12 quarterback. He's going to need to be paid like a top 5 quarterback. I mean, we'll see where the contract would slot in. And I can see where if you feel like he's never been able to get us over the top with guys like CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks, like is the grass greener on their side? Not always, but you kind of hope you want to aim higher, but sometimes you can miss the forest for the trees there.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Is good enough is the question. Dak Prescott is good. He's a top half of the league quarterback, but Jerry Jones could be looking at it and be like, I've seen great, and this isn't great. This is good, and that isn't good enough. So that's valid. But I just, also I cover the Tennessee Titans, and it's hard to find a good quarterback. I know maybe my PTSD is showing right now, Lauren.
Well, and Jerry Jones was willing to ride it out with Tony Romo for a decade, and he kind of felt like he was in a similar boat where it was like very good quarterback, but could never get them over the top. So does that mean he's not comfortable doing the same thing again with Dak? I mean, I would think just enjoy your 10, 11, 12 wins that teams like the Carolina Panthers wish they could have so consistently.
That's very true. That's very true. Well, another quarterback situation that's worth monitoring is the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the Steelers have officially named Russell Wilson not only QB1, but team captain, which I think says a lot about how the team feels about who the quarterback should be. I'm bullish on the Steelers this year. I think the Steelers can be a good team. I think the Steelers are making the playoffs. Let's hear from Chris Carter from Locked On Steelers with his reaction to the Russell Wilson news.
Hey everyone, Chris Carter here from the Locked On Steelers podcast, giving you an update on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Mike Tomlin has officially named Russell Wilson as the team's QB1 for the 2024 season. Now, if you've been keeping up to date with us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, that was no surprise. Russell Wilson was the pole position starter for going into training camp. In training camp, he suffered an injury, which led to Justin Fields getting more reps all throughout training camp, and Russell Wilson really didn't get that many chances to play with the first team during training camp. But all along, the perception was Russell Wilson was going to be the starter so long as he did his job, came back and looked like the veteran that he's supposed to be coming into his 13th NFL season. That happened, the Steelers felt, with his final preseason game when he led a touchdown drive, and it seems like all things are there. Justin Fields did close the gap. There's no doubt about that. He made this a bit more of a question, but there's also no question that Russell Wilson earned the QB1 job. We'll talk about that more on tomorrow's episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast.
All right, listen, I'm high on the Steelers, like I said. I think they got some good pieces on the offensive line. They got a little bit better there. I think Arthur Smith, while having his own faults as a coordinator and a play caller, is much better than Matt Canada. I think George Pickens is about to have an explosive year. They have a good backfield in general. And that defense, man, at the end of the day, Mike Tomlin wins games. And they still have a great defense. And I think they're going to be better on offense this year. And they made the playoffs last year with the crappy offense led by Matt Canada, which you can never trust Canada, okay? But I just think Russell Wilson is good enough to pilot the ship. He's obviously not the best version of himself, but he's good enough to pilot that ship. And that's all that Pittsburgh has needed to get into the playoffs for the last decade. You know, even the back years of Roethlisberger, he was still able to kind of just pilot a good roster. And someone you've covered extensively, Justin Fields, while Justin Fields is not who people hoped he would be, I still think he's a really good backup quarterback, and the Steelers can get creative with him enough to win games, even if Russell Wilson gets hurt. So do I think the Pittsburgh Steelers are a Super Bowl contender? Absolutely not. Do I think they make the wild card? 100% I do. Tell me why I'm crazy, Lauren.
I mean, it's tough because Mike Tomlin is so consistent. Like, they're going to be right in the mix. Right. I'm with you there, but I'm not nearly as bullish. I think the Arthur Smith quote upgrade from Matt Canada doesn't feel as significant as I mean, the guy who struggled to make stuff work with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson in Atlanta is supposed to make it with George Pickens and a bunch of nobodies at wide receiver, with Pat Freiermuth's a decent tight end and a couple of backs back there. Like, and you combine that with a quarterback in Russell Wilson who had some better skill talent in Denver and certainly in Seattle before that, and still couldn't take that next step. And I know you can blame offensive coordinator there, but again, like, offensive coordinator here doesn't feel amazing, maybe better than Matt Canada, but 31st is better than 32nd in the NFL. So it to me, like, I believe in their defense for sure. And I think the defense and an okay offense can win 8 or 9 games and be right there in the mix, but it's also a tougher division with the Bengals back healthy again. The Ravens obviously still clicking in the Browns. I mean, they could still, if they finished 4th in the division, I wouldn't be stunned, even if that's still 8 or 9 wins, but they can't all make the playoffs. So somebody in that division has to drop off. And I'm not sure who else it's going to be right now.
Right. It's a division with a lot of good rosters. I mean, that at the end of the day, it's a lot of good football teams there. I hear you though. I mean, Arthur Smith, what a fall from grace from his years with the Titans to go to the head coach of the Falcons. I will just say though, some people are just much better coordinators than they are head coaches, and all the head coaching duties can kind of take them away from how good they can be in other places. So that is something to watch, though. If the Steelers offense struggles again, he better call his dad and have a job waiting at FedEx for him, because things are getting ugly. All jokes aside, who does have the best roster in the NFL? Who has the deepest roster in the NFL? We're going to hear from Joe Marino from Locked On NFL Scouting, but I got to tell you, I don't agree with everything that Joe has to say. So we'll dive into that. Before we do, though, do want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the best place to buy tickets. I purchase all of my tickets on Game Time. Football, basketball, baseball. Went to a WNBA game with some Game Time tickets. Been to a Drake concert with some Game Time tickets. Right now, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks, and it makes getting tickets to your favorite events even easier. Game Time Picks lets you filter out all the fluff, so you only see the incredible deals on great seats. It allows you to not waste time searching through thousands of different tickets. They also have all-in pricing if you toggle on the feature. They have a view from your seat, so you know what you're going to be looking at when you sit down. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Also want to let you guys know that today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something that you'd love to learn? All right, for me, I've been really focusing on complex NFL defensive coverages lately. The thing is, though, as an adult, we don't really make time to learn new things as often as we should. Is that something that we lose in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back-to-school era can come at any age. I've worked with BetterHelp. It was a great experience. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, Lauren, we are going to cap off today's edition of Locked On NFL. Talk Jamar Chase, talk wide receivers in Miami, Dallas, Steelers, hitting all the heavy beats here. A great show going on. Do want to remind you guys, you're going to get a great show this afternoon from Tony Wiggins, the barber, in the barbershop, chopping it up with you guys. Make sure that you don't miss that. It is the new Locked On NFL, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The question is, Lauren, who has the deepest roster in the NFL? Our guys over at Locked On NFL Scouting talked about that recently. Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino, and the Detroit Lions were brought up, and Joe Marino does not think the Lions are the deepest roster in the league.
I think that the Detroit Lions have two players that are absolutely critical that I think their season would go differently if they don't have them. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown and it's Aiden Hutchinson. I don't think they can afford to lose either one. Like I get nervous about what that defense looks like without Aiden. And what if that offense does not have Amon-Ra St. Brown? I think the Lions are a safe bet to be an upper echelon team, but I think one of those two guys goes down, and I look at that team very differently.
Okay, I agree with Joe. I don't think the deepest roster in the league is the Detroit Lions, but I don't agree with the reason. If any team loses their two best players, or two of their three, I'll say Penei Sewell deserves conversation as one of the best players on that team, of course. Yep. But if any team loses two of their three best players, they're probably not going to do well. They're going to struggle. So I don't think you can judge a team on how deep their roster is necessarily by their top guys getting hurt. I think it's a bigger conversation than that. So for me personally, I'm looking at a team like the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, they have to be in that conversation of deepest rosters. They have talent on defense. They just bring in Ricky Pearsall, which I hope he gets better, out for the first 4 weeks as he deals with recovery from the gunshot wound. But, I mean, they have a good stable of backs. They lost Elijah Mitchell for the year, and they still have Jordan Mason. Like, I think San Francisco is a team that deserves to be mentioned in there. And the New York Jets are kind of a sleeper team for me. I know we talk about Aaron Rodgers and all that, but, I mean, look at their wide receiver group now. They brought in Mike Williams, who you maybe can't count on him necessarily, but I like Malachi Corley, the Yak King coming out of college, who they've added with Xavier Gibson, an unknown guy that they had before. On the offensive line, Ola Fashanu is a first-round pick. He's not even set to be a starter if everything stays correct in New York with their injuries. I know the offensive lineup front's a little older, but I think the Jets are a really, really good roster. And that's why a lot of people are like, if Rodgers stays healthy, they're going to be good. I mean, my guy, Alex Clancy, who I spoke with on yesterday's show, my everydayers will remember, he thinks the Jets win that division. So, I mean, you could tell how that impacts me and how crazy I think that is based on how my voice sounded right there trying to go over it. So I think the Jets have a great roster. I just don't think you can rely on them to predict them to win the division. But I don't think Detroit has the deepest roster, and it's not because of the reasons that Joe said.
Right. Well, I think there's sort of two separate lanes here, right? There's who has the most talent at the top, like who has the most, like who's the deepest in terms of their starters, right? Who has the
Right.
most positions with a really good player on it, where you just look left to right, their starting lineup. Wow, they're just stacked everywhere. And I think, yeah, San Francisco and New York are in that. And I think Detroit's in that conversation too. But when you talk
Right.
about depth here, like I think of like which team looks to me like the most resilient, not in terms of like, you know, who's tougher, but like who can withstand those types of injuries, because every team is going to face injuries. Most teams are going to lose at least one really good player. And I think the team that's got the most guys I would trust to step in if you lose one of or two of your best three players, like you talked about, it's the Houston Texans. Like I look across the board on their roster.
Right.
They've got 5 or 6 wide receivers I really like. They've got backup offensive linemen who I think can step in and start if they lose a starter there. The running back has some good depth to it. Defensively, they've got pass rushers. Their defensive line is two starters deep, and some good name to like in the backup of their secondary. Like you could take away Danielle Hunter from that defensive line, and it's going to hurt, but they've got good options there. You could take away Nico Collins or Stephon Diggs from their wide receiver core. They've got some good options there. Like their best, obviously non-quarterback players across the roster, they can most afford to lose one of those guys. Whereas, like you said with Detroit, like they lose Amon-Ra St. Brown or Aiden Hutchinson. I don't like their backups, or even San Francisco, like on their defensive line. I mean, it's Bosa and Hargrave and Leonard Floyd and Malik Collins. Those are great players. But one of those guys goes down, and it's Yetur Gross-Matos is stepping into the starting lineup there, and it's just not. You don't have a lot of confidence in like, oh, are they as bulletproof as some of these other teams?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, I think something that like enhances your point, if you were a defense attorney right now trying to make the case, they cut Noah Brown. I mean, Noah Brown's probably going to start for the Commanders, and he was a roster cut for them. I think that was probably the most surprising cut of the roster cut down days. I mean, Noah Brown isn't some generational talent or anything, but I think what a lot of casual NFL fans don't think about is like not everyone can be a star. Most people I talk to or don't like follow the NFL on a consistent basis, they're like, you know, that guy's a bum if he's not like a star. And it's like there is a middle class in the NFL that is very, very important to teams. And Noah Brown is one of those middle class wide receivers that does give you great depth. And last year when they dealt with injuries, Noah Brown had some insane games. I mean, he went for like $150 on the Bengals. So I can see where you're coming from. And I think if we look at roster cuts, that would say that you're probably right about it being the Texans.
The problem is it comes with like roster depth doesn't win football games, right? Your best backups aren't what gets you. I mean, backups can make the difference when you need to call on them, but at the end of the day, like depth is only good if your starters aren't out there. And if your starters aren't out there, you're screwed. Like one of my all-time favorite NFL quotes was from the Colts offensive coordinator, Tom Moore, who was asked back when Peyton Manning was their quarterback. And they're like, hey, why aren't you giving up the backup any of the reps? Peyton Manning would take every rep at practice. And the offensive coordinator said, if 18's not out there, we're effed. And we don't practice effed. So you know, so I mean, like it can be great for the Texans to have this super deep roster and have guys you can count on as backups. But when you lose starting talent, you lose talent, period. And yes, the Texans backups might be better than the 49ers backups or whatever, but like it's going to be mostly the starters, and the team with the better starters is going to be the team that wins those kind of head-to-head matchups and goes farther in the playoffs.
It's kind of like a race, you know, like it's good if you have a good middle portion where you can keep pace, but if you don't have that kick at the end to really leave people in the dust, it still won't be enough to win you enough. So good point there by Lauren. Excellent stuff. That's going to do it for us today here on the Locked On NFL podcast. Again, make sure you check out Tony Wiggins in the barbershop later this afternoon. As I tell you guys, stay safe out there, and hey, football right around the corner, folks.